Donna shared her living space with her husband Walter, who had become increasingly domineering despite not working. Walter, a stay-at-home spouse, managed household duties while Donna worked to support them financially. Their arrangement was intended to provide stability, but Walter's controlling nature undermined Donna's efforts, making her feel her contributions were futile. One day, Walter declared with a smug expression that he would allow his parents to live in their house, suggesting that Donna could move in with her in-laws without her consent. Donna was stunned and speechless at his audacity, especially considering she owned the house. This incident was a breaking point for her, having tolerated Walter's overbearing attitude for too long. Walter often issued commands as if he were entitled to do so, once demanding Donna fetch him ice cream late at night while he relaxed, despite her exhaustion from work. When Donna suggested he could get it himself, Walter laughed and insinuated that upsetting him could have consequences. His behavior wasn't just frustrating, it was exhausting. Donna felt increasingly disrespected and devalued, questioning the sustainability of living with someone who claimed superiority simply because he was the husband. She realized that if things didn't change, she couldn't continue in this way. Walter needed to understand the impact of his actions, and Donna decided it was time for him to face the consequences of his domineering behavior. At that moment, I realized that dealing with Walter on top of my already stressful job would push my stress levels to their limit. So, I told him, "I'm really tired, I'm sorry, I'm going to rest in my room." Walter didn't appreciate my response and blocked my way, challenging me. "Wait, what's with that attitude towards your husband? I could kick you out right now if I wanted to. Do you think it's all right to upset your spouse like that?" He looked furious. It baffled me how he could act so authoritative without contributing financially and how easily he could distress me, yet he couldn't handle the slightest inconvenience himself. It was like dealing with a child's tantrum. "I'm sorry, but I'm exhausted. Please just try to understand," I replied, forcing a smile, no longer wanting to engage further. Walter sighed deeply and muttered, "You're such a disappointment as a wife." I didn't have the energy to argue. I simply repeated, "I'm sorry," and retreated to my room. Day by day, Walter's overbearing behavior wore me down, but I was too exhausted to confront him. Then, one day, I caught a severe cold, which the doctor diagnosed as a stress-induced fever. Immediately, I thought of Walter's constant pressure. I was so ill that I couldn't move, so I took a day off from work and could only lie in bed. When I informed Walter of my condition, he snapped, "A cold? That's just an excuse. Go to work. You're useless." His harsh words seemed to make my fever spike even higher. He declared, "I won't be taking care of you. This is your mess. Deal with it." So I was left alone in my room, moaning from the fever with no one to help. I was too weak to prepare anything for myself, and I didn't want to face Walter again for fear of more verbal abuse. My temperature reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The fever was so intense that my body was drenched in sweat. I couldn't even get up to change my soaked clothes. I lay there pondering how much easier things might be if I could just pass away. With these grim thoughts, I endured a painful night alone. Perhaps it was the fever talking, but in my heart, I knew something had to change. Throughout the night, as the sun disappeared and the stars took over the sky, a deep sense of loneliness and doubt overwhelmed me. I longed for Walter's support, not even to cure my fever, but just to bring me an ice pack, apply a cool compress, and ask if I was okay. Sadly, this was just a fantasy. Instead, the words I received from him were harsh and uncaring, cutting deep and stirring up new anxieties. I questioned why I was the only one suffering, what I had done wrong, and why things couldn't be smoother between us. Once these thoughts began, I couldn't hold back the tears. The pain was just too much. After 5 days of rest, my fever subsided enough for me to return to work. My colleagues and bosses expressed their concern, asking if I was truly okay to be back. Although I was still recuperating, I felt compelled to support our household financially and couldn't afford more time off. Their genuine concern touched me deeply, such a stark contrast to Walter's indifference, and nearly brought me to tears again. At this point, a voice inside me screamed that I could no longer deal with Walter's behavior. I was pushing myself too hard, ignoring the signs that this way of life was unsustainable. Deep down, I knew that I couldn't keep going like this without eventually collapsing from the strain. By now, my feelings for Walter had significantly diminished, yet I lacked the energy to contemplate a separation. Amid these tumultuous feelings, I trudged through my days, working hard, returning home exhausted, and catering to Walter's unpredictable demands. This had become my daily routine. Then, one day while I was trying to find a moment of peace in my room, Walter called out, wanting to discuss something serious. It had been a long time since we had a real conversation. Typically, Walter would make significant decisions unilaterally. With a heavy heart, I sat down for the discussion, fearing what might come next. To my shock, Walter, with unexpected enthusiasm, announced, "I'll let my parents live in this house. You can't even cook, so leave." The first word that slipped out of my mouth was, "What?" He continued, "You need to leave because you're living with my in-laws." I was stunned, unable to accept the reality of his selfish demands. The situation had reached a breaking point, and I realized something had to change. As Walter steered the conversation forward, he revealed his plans to change the ownership of our house, transferring it to his name and his parents'. He bluntly stated his intentions to divorce me and start a new life, declaring his decision final and immune to my opinions. I felt utterly disregarded, my feelings trampled under decisions made without my consent. Walter, inflated with his man-of-the-house ego, seemed only concerned with his desires. My heart sank as I realized the impossibility of continuing life with him. Ignoring my growing detachment, Walter jeered, "You love me so much, don't you? I know this is shocking coming from a husband you love so dearly, but I'm sorry, I just want to take care of my family. Please understand." His words, meant to sound considerate, felt more like a scolding. I wanted to shout that he was wrong. Any affection I once felt for Walter had evaporated, leaving behind only disbelief at his selfishness and regret for not severing ties sooner. Why hadn't I left him earlier? If I had, perhaps he wouldn't have had the opportunity to exploit and demean me so thoroughly. I even resented my past self for being too lenient with him. Seeing my visible distress, Walter misread my pain as lingering love, thinking I couldn't bear the thought of a divorce. But he was mistaken. My feelings for him had long since faded into nothing more than disdain for a man who wrongly believed I still cared. Determined to set things straight, I said firmly, "Fine then, I'll leave." Walter gasped, "What?" He hadn't anticipated my readiness to accept the divorce and move on. He needed to understand that the old me, who always bailed him out, was gone for good. From now on, whatever happened to Walter, he would face it without me because our relationship was over. Seeing my resolve, Walter stood shocked and frozen. I seized the moment to head to my room and pack the essentials. I knew I couldn't take larger items today and would need to arrange for movers later. As I began to pack, Walter hurried over, perhaps finally realizing the gravity of the situation. Walter approached me, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Are you sure about this? If we divorce, we'll be strangers." I smiled softly and replied, "I've already fallen out of love with you. Letting go feels like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders." Hearing this, Walter stood there, looking bewildered and lost. I nodded, thanked him for the years together, and walked out of the house. His worried expression lingered in my mind as I returned to my parents' home. Upon explaining everything to my parents, they initially reacted with fury at Walter's behavior, but soon calmed down, reassured by my resolve and the plan I had in place. I began to recuperate at my parents' home, taking the first steps by initiating the divorce proceedings. After I sent the divorce papers, Walter messaged me, "Are you sure about this? I don't know if it's really a good thing, but I don't have any feelings for you anymore. If we've gone this far, there's no turning back." His message concluded with a request to expedite the divorce. "I feel so much better now that you're gone, so fill out the divorce papers quickly." I replied, but received no response. A few days later, I received the completed divorce papers from Walter with his sections already filled out. I promptly completed my part and submitted it to the county office. Now, Walter and I were officially divorced. During the divorce, we divided our assets. Walter received the house, as he had insisted, so I transferred ownership to him and chose to move on. The house had never really felt like home to me. It was more of a burden. Instead, I sought alimony from Walter, which his parents initially covered since he wasn't working. However, he was now job hunting, likely planning to repay them once he secured employment. But as is often the case, reality doesn't always align with plans. A month after the divorce was finalized, I had moved out of my parents' home into a new place, enjoying a more peaceful life. Then I received a call from Walter. Honestly, it was annoying. I could guess why he was calling, but ignoring him might lead to more complications. So, knowing I'd have to address it sooner or later for the sake of my future, I answered the phone with a firm, "Hello, what do you want?" Completely fed up, I wanted him to get straight to the point. Reluctantly, I listened as he pleaded, "Please help me." His desperate tone made me chuckle. Walter was clearly in a tough spot, and while part of me felt distant, another part was mildly amused by the irony of his desperation. Walter's call caught me off guard. I hadn't expected things to have deteriorated so quickly. "Well, what's going on? You need to tell me the whole story," I replied, half amused by the situation. I suspected why Walter might be struggling, but I wanted him to lay it all out himself. With a hesitant voice and stumbling over his words, Walter began to explain. He had taken over the house after our divorce and managed it fine for a month. However, he now faced a rent payment he couldn't meet due to his unemployment. Desperate, he had asked my former parents-in-law, who were on a pension, for help. But the rent was much steeper than anyone anticipated, about $2,500, a sum they couldn't afford on their fixed income. My former in-laws were livid, accusing him of misleading them. "This isn't what we agreed to," they insisted, placing the blame squarely on Walter. Feeling lost and unsure, Walter called me nearly in tears. "I didn't realize the rent would be so high. The place is a mess now. What are you going to do about it?" Frustrated and overwhelmed, Walter was now trying to pin the blame on me. Admittedly, I hadn't discussed the specifics of the rent before our separation, but it was Walter's folly to assume responsibility for the house without understanding the financial commitments involved. He had pushed me away, treating me like an outsider, and now he was facing the consequences of his decisions. Despite this, he seemed unable to accept responsibility and reached out to me for help. I couldn't help but sigh at his audacity. Ignoring the strain in his voice, Walter continued urgently, "Please, I need your help. We can't keep going like this. I need you." His desperation was palpable. The rent due date had likely already passed, which meant they might be behind on payments. The landlord of that house had a reputation for being temperamental and strict about rent deadlines. I remember being warned repeatedly when I was still living there. Never be late with the rent. If they missed a payment, they would face serious repercussions. Walter, having met the landlord a few times, knew exactly how intimidating they could be. His call was a last-ditch effort, driven by sheer desperation. When Walter called me pleading for help, he said, "Please, just cover the rent for 1 month. I don't have anyone else to turn to. You still care about me, right? If someone you care about is in trouble, you should help them out." His tone was still self-centered, as if he hadn't changed at all. I wanted to tell him straight that my feelings for him had long since faded. But instead, I held back and replied coldly, "I'm sorry, but I don't have any obligation to help you. You were the one who cut me off, and now you expect me to assist you when it's convenient for you. That's not fair." Walter tried to defend himself. "Please don't be so cold. I really can't handle this alone. Whether you still love me or not doesn't matter now. We were married once, right? Can't you help me out just this once?" "No, you were the one who left me. Even before that, my feelings for you had already cooled. It's been a long time since I stopped loving you," I responded firmly. Hearing Walter's dejected voice on the other end, he said, "I can't believe it," which struck a chord deep within me. For so long, I had endured everything. Even when Walter was selfish, took me for granted, or mistreated me, especially when I was sick, I stayed by his side, hoping to salvage our marriage. I worked tirelessly for the life we had, but this was the outcome. Why hadn't I left sooner when my love for him faded? Why didn't I distance myself earlier? These regrets flooded in, mingling with the anger I felt towards him. Walter never truly faced me. He never showed real concern, never protected me, and never embraced the idea of navigating life together as a team. All this time, he treated me like a maid, a mere money-making machine. Each time he acted this way, he seemed oblivious to my suffering. Yet now, despite all this being a result of his actions, he came pleading for help as if he were the victim. His self-centered attitude was repelling. "Please help me, I'm begging you. What about getting married again? Let's start over properly this time. I promise I'll never push you away again," Walter proposed desperately. I couldn't help but feel a mix of incredulity and annoyance. How could he think a simple plea for help could erase the years of neglect and misunderstanding? His desperation was evident, but so was the clarity of my decision not to fall back into the same pattern. I had moved on, and it was time for Walter to do the same. I couldn't help but chuckle bitterly at Walter's desperate suggestion. "Are you kidding me? All of this is the result of your actions. I've been trying to find peace in my way for a long time. I kept hoping you would face reality, and now you want me to start over with you, pretending none of that ever happened? Do you expect me to go back to those miserable days? That's never going to happen. I refused to return to that life no matter what." Emotions overwhelmed me, and tears started to flow. I couldn't tell if they were from anger or sadness. Walter remained silent on the other end, having nothing to say in response to my words. Unable to continue the conversation any longer, I simply said goodbye and hung up. Walter didn't call back, and to avoid hearing his voice ever again, I blocked his number. Later, I heard from mutual friends that Walter and his family were evicted from their home. Walter had tried to persuade my former in-laws to cover his rent, but they were furious, refusing his request and further upsetting the landlord. With no other options, they were forced to leave. Walter hasn't had much luck finding a full-time job and is now working part-time to make ends meet. Meanwhile, my former in-laws had to sell their house and are now crammed into a rundown apartment, all three of them together. Meanwhile, I've been deeply focused on my work, and my boss has even discussed a promotion with me. There's a possibility I might become the first female manager in our company, and I've been receiving admiration from both colleagues and juniors. Sometimes friends inquire if I'm thinking about getting married again. Honestly, after my past experiences, I have a rather negative view of marriage. The idea of dating or marrying again doesn't appeal to me right now, but life is long and there's no rush. Many people in this generation live their entire lives happily unmarried. What matters most to me is living a life without regrets and staying true to myself. With that in mind, I want to continue navigating life at my own pace, embracing whatever comes my way with strength and independence.
When I opened it, guess what I found? My mother-in-law's voice was sharp, almost triumphant. I froze. Could she have discovered the truth? My heart raced as her words echoed in my mind. "You think you can deceive me?" she added mockingly. My name is Penelope. I met my husband by chance at work. I'm a consultant, and sometimes I give talks about my work. I don't do them on a large scale, but one of the attendees was my future husband. The theme of the lecture at that time was what it means to make money. Many of the attendees were self-employed or CEOs, but he was just an ordinary office worker. I had the impression that he listened to the lecture very seriously. Even after the seminar was over, he came to me with his own questions and thanked me directly by email, which made me feel that he was very interested in what I had to say. On the other hand, I also had the impression that he was somewhat unreliable. When he participated in the workshop, he made a subtle comment along the lines of, "I did my best to pay for the workshop. My workshops are like a side job to me, so the participation fee is not that high." But I won't lie, I was happy to hear that. After that, he often participated in my workshops, and I think our feelings grew closer as we interacted. Finally, he confessed his feelings to me. However, I was aware that there was a significant difference in our financial abilities. I've reached a point in my career where I'm not worried about money, and he has only the title of an ordinary employee. I think it's normal for people to think that I'm not a good match for him. But I've been with a few men while doing this job, and most of them have been financially capable, though a little over the top in my opinion, even though I have a job like this. I know deep down that money is not everything, so I accepted the relationship with him. Later, we started talking about marriage, and Robert proposed to me, but even then I could not accept Robert's proposal right away because he didn't spend much money on our dates. I don't know how to say this, but I really don't think he has any money to spend on dates. He also told me that he wanted me to live with his mother when we got married, which was another complication for me. When I asked him why he wanted me to move in with her, he was very clear. "My dad passed away, and my mom is not strong enough to work. I've managed to make ends meet on my salary, but it's been tough. That's why I need your help with living expenses." I knew that in this situation, the only thing that came to mind was the unreliability I felt at first. But in the end, I accepted his proposal because I knew he was sincere. I think I paid more for the dates than he did, but I didn't stop going out with him, even in that situation. He still made plans for our dates and prepared gifts for my birthday and other occasions. I felt that he was easier to date than the men I had dated in the past, who had a strange sense of pride, because I was the one who earned the money when he had financial problems. With this in mind, I agreed to live with him at his parents' house and help with living expenses, and we decided to get married. However, my decision turned out to be a mistake. Before the wedding, I had visited his mother at her old, run-down house, and she seemed to accept me. After the wedding, when I went to greet her again at her home, I thought our life together would go well, but I did not realize at the time that such a tragedy was awaiting us. It was as if they had been living in poverty. I thought it would be difficult for me to continue living in this house, so I talked to them about it. "I would pay for it, so can we remodel the house a little bit?" I suggested. She was overjoyed, and my mother-in-law immediately agreed. It was a little difficult for me to accept the idea of living together without her approval, so I was glad. I was relieved that I could pay for the remodeling, and the house became a reasonably comfortable place to live. However, as we continued to live together, I gradually began to feel a sense of discomfort. My mother-in-law did not pay her utility bills online, but by check when the bill arrived. One day I found an electric bill in the mailbox and told my mother-in-law about it. "Would you go and pay it for me?" she said. I was confused for a moment when she said that, but I thought she would pay me back, and it was not that much money. So I went to pay it, as she asked. However, after that, my mother-in-law and husband never mentioned anything about the electricity bill, and I began to wonder if they were aware that I had paid it. When the water or gas bill came, my mother-in-law would turn to me again. "Could you go and pay them for me?" She kept saying to me, "That would be great." After that, neither my mother-in-law nor my husband mentioned the money to me. I don't care about the money, but I wish they would say a word about it. We are newlyweds, and I don't want to ruin the mood. Besides, I knew that my husband didn't make much money, so I didn't want to be stingy. I decided to pay the utilities myself, but even after that, I had to cover various expenses in the name of living costs. Sometimes my mother-in-law would tell me, "We ran out of detergent," or "We only have 2 rolls of toilet paper left," and she would send me to buy them. However, I was always the one paying for them. She never contributed, but I didn't mention it because it wasn't a significant amount of money. But as time passed, her requests started to grow. She began saying things like, "This microwave is so old," or "I've always wondered if this refrigerator is big enough for the 3 of us. Penelope, what do you think?" I would reply, "I think it's small too." And then she would say, "Do you think I should buy a new one?" When I agreed that a new one might be a good idea, she responded, "I thought so. Then would you go and buy a new one, Penelope?" It felt like she had been waiting for my answer. When the expenses started reaching larger amounts, even though I could afford it, I started to reflect. I realized I had been paying for most of our food and other household costs, which made me question what my husband's salary was being used for. It became harder for me to keep up with my mother-in-law's demands, so I decided it was time to discuss the finances. I suggested, "How about having Robert handle buying the new appliances? I don't know much about home appliances." My mother-in-law's expression changed, and she snapped, "How dare you ask for Robert's money? What kind of wife are you? Robert works hard too, so it's not fair to take advantage of his money." I was shocked because she completely ignored the fact that I too worked hard. She then added, "You earn a lot, so you should save as well. A wife is supposed to protect the family finances." Her words stung because I had been managing the family budget and saving in my own way, without anyone telling me to do so. It angered me that she, who never contributed to our living expenses, felt entitled to lecture me about finances. It even made me wonder what Robert was doing with his salary. I decided to ask Robert about it directly. One day I boldly asked, "Hey Robert, do you save money? I'm paying for everything around the house, so I assume you've saved quite a bit." His reply stunned me. "How do you expect me to save money? I spend it all on drinks and gambling. Besides, I have my hobbies too. What I do with my hard-earned money is my business," he firmly concluded. I was floored. Not only was he not saving, but he was wasting his money on gambling and hobbies, all while I paid for the household expenses. "So it turns out I'm paying for everything, while your salary goes to gambling and hobbies?" I exclaimed angrily. His expression hardened and he snapped, "What do you mean by that? You pay my bills so I can gamble. If you want me to make more money, then praise me for working hard." His response felt like a slap in the face. I couldn't believe he thought I should be grateful while he squandered money. My distrust of both Robert and my mother-in-law grew. It had been almost 5 years since we started living together, and I realized I'd been shouldering all the expenses. I felt like I was being taken advantage of, and I no longer wanted to keep paying for everything. The next day, I decided to speak to my mother-in-law. I told her, "I've been thinking, and I believe we should split the utility and food costs with Robert." I thought I was being reasonable, but she became furious. "Don't you understand what I said before? Besides, you're living in my house. Don't you feel grateful that I'm taking care of you? Since you're living here, it's only natural for you to pay the expenses," she retorted. I wanted to say, "It's true I live here, but I'm the one taking care of you." It was her idea for us to live together, yet she acted like I was imposing on her. I couldn't deny it anymore. I no longer wanted to be part of this family. Then, as if to seal the deal, my mother-in-law asked, "How much money do you have saved right now?" I had a bad feeling about her question. She had been relying on my earnings from the start, and I feared that if I told her the truth, she would try to use it for her own purposes. I replied, "I have about $300,000 in my bank account." Her response was shocking. "If you put it in your bank account, I can't use it. Make sure I can spend that money." I couldn't understand why she was so obsessed with other people's money, but this is like my hunch coming true. I put some money in the safe so that I wouldn't touch my savings. I said something like that in the spur of the moment. Then my mother-in-law smiled and said, "Then I'll forgive you for your grievance against me and tell you to behave yourself as a wife from now. Since I haven't felt at ease since you came, I will take a trip to a resort." With these words, she walked away. I didn't understand what she meant. I could not help but wonder if she was thinking of using the money in the safe to go on a trip. But when I woke up the next day, My mother-in-law was already gone, and so was the safe. I seriously doubted my mother-in-law's nerve and asked my husband about her. Who cares if she goes on a trip? Mom needs to relax once in a while, he said calmly. I can't understand this family at all. My mother-in-law was basically stealing money by making me pay all the living expenses because I lived in her home. She and her son would be the ones to suffer the pain later for what they did. When I came home after work that day, my mother-in-law said to me in a terrible manner, "You lied to me, didn't you? There was no money in the safe." Apparently, she had gone to the airport with the safe. I tried so hard to open the safe, but all I found inside was a bunch of weird junk and useless comic books. I was so pissed off I threw it all away. "How dare you humiliate me?" she continued angrily. My mother-in-law was yelling and ranting as she opened the safe and showed me what was inside. When Robert came home from work, and my mother-in-law explained the situation to him, but it was not me who he was angry with, but his own mother. "You seriously threw everything away? You've got to be kidding me," he exclaimed fiercely. I guess my mother-in-law was surprised at Robert's attitude. I think my mother-in-law wanted him to blame me. But what my mother-in-law threw away, which might have been just a useless piece of junk to her, was actually the contents of his treasure collection. It was my precious collection, and all of them cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, Robert said, his frustration clear. Inside the safe were limited edition comic books and action figures, and collecting them was Robert's money. There wasn't a penny of money in it, though. Anyway, Robert was in a state of confusion after having something important thrown away. I knew he liked those things, but I didn't know he had them in that safe. But I never lied about anything. I said there was a little bit in the safe, but I didn't say it was money. But my mother-in-law tried to make it my fault, while my husband was furious with her. But Penelope said there was money in the safe. Blame her. She tried to direct his anger towards me. You wouldn't keep anything important in a safe that you could easily carry around, would you? I retorted, trying to reason with them, and added, I think Robert probably put it in there because he didn't want his hobby to be known. As I said this, my mother-in-law finally felt remorse for what she had done. Robert, I'm sorry, she said, almost down on her knees. But of course Robert must have valued it as much as his own life. He didn't seem to be willing to forgive his mother at all. I guess the parent and child who jointly used my money ended up having a falling out. In this case, I decided to do what I had been thinking. I don't want to be with a family that uses my money without my permission anymore, I said firmly. So Robert, let's get a divorce. My mother-in-law and Robert tried to stop me from doing so. Of course they would, because they will be poor again when I am gone. I have already given you a luxurious life for 5 years, and I don't want to be merciful to you anymore. If you won't give me a divorce, I will fight in court. I can get as many lawyers as I want. Please make sure you have a lawyer who can match that, I warned them. But of course they don't have the money to afford such a powerful lawyer. Besides, I will tell them about how you destroyed the safe to go after my money. Even if there was no money, what you did was a crime. I know a lot of lawyers, and I will fight for you as much as you want. I bluffed a little. I can actually get a lawyer, but I know I can't make my mother-in-law a criminal. But that scared them both so much that they decided to easily grant me a divorce. I took the appliances and other things I had bought at their house and left the house with all the major furniture and appliances gone. Their house was probably poorer than it had been before I moved in with them. You will never make any money by taking things that belong to others, is what I explained at my workshop. I said over and over that it would only hurt you sooner or later. Was Robert even listening to anything I said? But I was right, and my mother-in-law and Robert are now living in such poverty that it is difficult to have a normal life. On the other hand, as for me, I have spent a lot of extra money and time in the past 5 years, but as a consultant, I am glad to have had this realistic experience. If you try dirty tricks like this, nothing good will come to you. I think it was a positive experience for me to be able to use these words more persuasively.